So I don't know if you remember a couple years ago when Chipotle invented queso. Um, they made a huge deal of it. They must have spent I don't know, probably millions of dollars advertising their invention of queso. And I kind of thought man, I've been eating queso for years. You're a little late to the party. I think sometimes when we hear the Advent calendar piece, depending on what background you grew up, maybe you grew up non-church, maybe you grew up in a not liturgical piece, and you're like, I don't understand what the Advent calendar piece is and how this works. Some of us grew up in a more liturgical background, and we're like, duh, why is it waiting so long? The purpose of this Advent, both the wreath making and the devotionals and the Bible studies, is that as we're going towards the birth of Jesus, that we are preparing not just the gifts and not just the festivals and not just the parties, but we're preparing our hearts to worship. And that we're being deliberate and methodical. And this is an awesome opportunity. Maybe you've done the Advent calendar every year for the last 50 decades, and you're good to go, okay? I think it's an awesome practice because you're obviously doing it. And if this is hey, I've never done the Advent calendar, it's new to me, I'm not sure how to do it. Maybe you're not in a rhythm of doing regular devotions, or you are doing personal devotions, but you don't know how to do family devotions or devotion time as a couple. This is an awesome opportunity to engage and to start this. There's resources available. Even the making of the wreaths, it's not a magical piece, but it's a reminder as we're going through that month of December is what we're really preparing for. And I think all of our hearts can easily get sucked into all this extra stuff that goes on, and we miss the whole reason behind that. So if you're saying, hey, it's about time we've done something in Advent, then lead the way, right? If you've been we've been waiting for this, lead the way. And if you say, I'm not sure, I've never done this, I would love for you to just take a risk, participate, join in, and I think it'll be really good for your heart and for your soul this season. So that's kind of my plug for Advent. I'm personally excited for me, for my family, and I hope that's something you'll join us in as well. So today we kind of have this gap period between the book of Acts and Thanksgiving season. And I was just thinking and sort of meditating on that and praying about how to utilize that time well. One of the things that kind of came to my mind was that Thanksgiving is a time where I think ideally we want to be thankful out of overflow, and there's just so many things. It's sort of this feeling that sort of bubbles up, that we're just we are so thankful. And someone comes to us and we're like, how are you doing? You're #blessed, and we love that. I don't know if they use that song, but we just love that, and that's an awesome feeling, and that's not a bad thing, right? But I think sometimes we kind of think, well, if I'm not there, Thanksgiving is not for me, or I'm going to take a pass on it. You're well, the history of Thanksgiving is and so we kind of are well, it's not for me. And what I want to look at this morning is Psalm 23. And maybe hopefully lift our eyes. It's been a passage that God's been using in my heart quite a bit over the last several months. And lift our eyes above the stuff and sort of the circumstances and the people and the difficulties and the economy and the elections that are thankfully over, and so we don't have to see any more ads, and really tune our hearts, adjust our hearts to really what we should be thankful for in the first place, and that's our Savior. So a simple message this morning from Psalm 23, maybe even more just a personal reflection with you guys. But this is a Psalm of David. People debate kind of when it's written. Most people seem to lean towards it's written when he's a king. But he's going to be alluding back to an analogy that was very close to his heart, because he originally was a shepherd. He says in the first verse, he says, the Lord is my shepherd. I think this is fascinating. He quickly taps into analogy, not that's only familiar to him, but also kind of implies something about him. Remember, he's, at this point in time, most likely a king. He is a mighty warrior. He is a brave man. And yet, he identifies with a job that he had, a sheep. I think it'd be kind of awesome if we were the Bible, used an analogy for us, you are a flock of eagles, or you are a herd or a pride of lions, pride, I think is the right word. Like some vicious animals, something strong and resilient and fierce. And yet, more often than any other analogy, we're described as sheep. It's not that great, And yet, David is putting himself in this category. Like, as a former shepherd, as a current, most likely current king, as a mighty man of valor, he's saying, like, hey, I'm a sheep. Like, I get lost, I get hurt, I get led astray, I do stupid stuff, and yet I need this shepherd. And notice he points to the shepherd. He doesn't say, like, I am the shepherd. Like, I am the shepherd of my own sheep, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But he says, no, he's like, the Lord is my shepherd. He's pointing to this in the state of being a sheep, in the state of being someone who is vulnerable and led astray and easy to get lost. He's saying, like, God is my shepherd. And notice the personalization in there. He doesn't say, like, God is a shepherd or God is, like, the shepherd. He's saying, like, God is my shepherd. And I think this is amazing that he's not just acknowledging a truth, but he's saying, in my life, as I'm walking around, that God, the Lord, is my shepherd. And even as a human shepherd, he fought a lion and he fought a bear, which seems kind of crazy. He literally would lay down his life for the sheep, and yet he sees God as his personal shepherd. I think sometimes we come to this and we say, like, oh, well, like, I'm in a tough spot. I know God's there. But I think sometimes the reason that gratitude is hard for us is because we've failed to personalize that piece. It's like, God is not just like the shepherd of people or the shepherd of the church or the shepherd of kids, but he is my shepherd and he's your shepherd. And so he goes on to this next phrase. He says, I shall not want, or I shall not lack. It's interesting. It's both a declaration, like a statement of reality and a statement of faith. Like, the statement of faith is that it doesn't mean that there's times where he doesn't feel like he wants anything more. Like, that there isn't times where he wishes circumstances were different. You only have to read the rest of the Psalms to learn that. But he's saying, like, in faith I'm going to say, I shall not want. But the reality is because God is his shepherd, that he doesn't lack anything. And this is interesting because I think sometimes we feel like we are lacking. Like, we don't have enough strength, we don't have energy, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough friends, or the friends we do are no good. You know what I mean? We feel our lack so deeply. And yet what David's saying is because God himself is my shepherd, I know I'm not lacking anything. He says that he makes me to lie down in green pastures. I think this is fascinating. So I went to Israel a couple years ago, and I don't know about you, but you picture the shepherds on the hills of Bethlehem, like for me, and I kind of pictured like Ireland, like green grass everywhere, these like sheep dancing through the lush grass, and it's just this picturesque scene. And you get to Israel, and you get even to this area around Bethlehem, which David would have been close to. There's not a lot of green grass. In fact, it's pretty unpleasant land. I mean, the Israeli people do an amazing job cultivating that, but there's just not a lot of green. In fact, I learned when I was there that the only place that they raise sheep is where the ground is too poor to raise crops. So if they can raise crops, they will, but where they can't, they raise sheep, because with the skill of a shepherd, he can still find this green grass. And so what he's acknowledging is even in the midst of a barren land, that there is green grass that God leads him to. It doesn't just lead him to, but it says he causes me to lie down in this. There's this piece where sometimes like God's like, relax. I've got this. You're safe. You're under my control. And it's a pleasant place. It says that he leads beside the still waters. Once again, being not a shepherd, but my understanding is that sheep really don't like turbulent water. They don't like to drink in turbulent waters. They can fall in, get sucked in, swept downstream. Big problems. And so this idea of still water, it's a useful water. It's a restorative water. It's a water that can be led there. And there again, in Israel, not a lot of water. It's not abundant, and yet the shepherd knows, and he is deliberate and intentional in finding these places of refreshment. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still water. And this phrase, he restores my soul. I think this phrase is amazing because we have doctors who are amazing at fixing our bodies. We have teachers who are amazing at fixing or improving our minds. But to restore the soul is something supernatural. And how do you fix brokenness? How do you fix heartache? How do you fix betrayal? How do you fix the inward corruption that can be there? How do you fix that resentment that we just do not want to let go of? Well, we need a soul doctor. We need someone who can fix the inside of us, which is far more difficult than fixing the outside seems to be. And yet, David is saying that here, this shepherd, he restores my soul. And I think this is such an encouraging piece because in this we hear that the shepherd isn't just trying to keep us physically safe, but he wants us to be renewed internally. He brings us back to life. And maybe this morning you're coming into this Thanksgiving season, you're like, man, I feel broken. I feel messed up. I'm discouraged. I'm wrecked. I'm in pain. And what's so good news is that there's a shepherd that can restore you from the inside out. That he's not just worried about you looking good on a Sunday, but he wants to fix you on the Monday. And that he can bring you back. It says that he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. The translations debate this a little bit, this word righteousness. It might actually be better translated right paths. He leads me in the correct paths. Why? So he gets the honor and the glory. How many times do we feel like our life is not on the correct path? And namely, we've ordained and determined and told God exactly how life is going to go, and then that path gets shifted, adjusted, delayed. Look at David's life. He was promised and anointed to be king. And then for years, he gets chased around with someone trying to kill him, who is the king. And he can't kill the person who's trying to kill him. You talk about moving paths, delayed paths, disappointing paths. And what David's saying is, this shepherd, he leads me in the right paths. That wherever our life is, as we submit to God and to his wisdom, that the paths that he has for us are the right ones. They might not be the ones we picked. They might not be the ones that we prefer. They're not the ones that we told God that we were going to take. But they're the right paths. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. This verse right here, I think, often gets brought up because in funerals. This has become, Psalm 23, unfortunately, becomes sort of the funeral passage. That you're supposed to read it at funerals. This is a great passage to read at a funeral. But notice what he's saying here. He says, I'm walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Now, in Israel, there's actually a valley called the shadow of death. It's outside of Jerusalem. And part of the reason for this is that it's a massive graveyard, and it has been for centuries. I'm not sure that it was like this at David's time, but the other reason it's called the shadow of death is that it's so deep that rarely does light get to the bottom of it. It's one of these, a narrow canyon, if you will, that it takes just the perfect instance for you to see anything. And so when he's saying here that he's walking through this valley of the shadow of death, he's describing a situation where he can't see the top. Now, I don't know if you're like me. I love visibility. I love to be at the top. My wife makes fun of me because we go somewhere and she's like, oh yeah, he's gonna go to the top. Because I love to be able to see, and I love to be able to get that perspective and that distance and that vision. And yet here, this is the exact opposite. David's saying, he's like, I'm in the bottom of a pit, and it's a valley, and it's so great of a valley, they call it the shadow of death. Even though I'm there, I will fear no evil. Isn't this a reality? Is that when we can't see out of something, we can't see through something, we can't see past something, we can't see over something, what happens to our hearts is that we tend to fear. We become afraid. We become gripped by all the things that we do not know. But notice the word he uses to describe how he's going through this. He said, even though I'm walking through the valley. Some of us, we want to run through the valley, don't we? Like we're like, hey, I'm in a valley, but I am going to get out the other side as quickly as possible. Like Mach 2 through this valley, let's go. Or some of us are like, I'm in a valley and I'm going to sit here. Like I'm just going to park in this valley and I'm not going anywhere. Like I'm going to like sort of wallow in this valley. And yet what he describes here is that he's walking through this valley. That there's deliberate steps, there's deliberate action, there's deliberate movement. Now it's not certain when this valley ends because part of the problem with the valley is you can't see when it ends. You don't know how long or how far that takes. But he says he's not going to fear in the valley. Why? For you are with me. That's the secret. Like, why is David not afraid in this valley? Well, because God's with him. And I think sometimes it's easy to think that God really loves us when things are good, and the goal is to get back to good so that we can be loved again. And you know what David's saying is, hey, I'm in the valley, I'm okay. Because God, He's with me. He's with you. And so whether that's you're facing sickness that's tearing apart either your body or sometimes even worse, the body of someone you care about, and you're in that valley and you can't see past it, you can't see through it, you can't see around it, you don't need to be afraid because God is with you. You're going to school. And there's bullies there. I mean, bullies are not a new thing. You just used to be able to, you could punch them in the nose. So, you're going to school and you're facing people that are mean and unkind and they don't want to be your friend and you try to love them. And the more you try to love them, they hate on you. That's okay. Because God's there. Or you're dealing with depression that you think, man, I'm never going to get out of this. And you're afraid that it'll never end. In that moment, it's okay. Because God's there. And I think we make a mistake when we assume we have to be good to get to God. And God greets us in the bad. It's interesting because he said God's making him lie down in green pastures. He's leading beside still waters, but God is still there in the dark valleys. And that's something that our hearts can latch on to. Because we don't know when things are going to end. We don't know when we've got answers. But we know who's with us. And depending on who's with us, it doesn't matter how long it takes to get out. Because he's there. This summer, I had the privilege of driving a Jeep through Moab. And I watched about a minute of a YouTube video to figure out how to drive Jeeps off-road. And based on your laughter, you're not wrong. And you get to some of these things and you realize, maybe I should have watched this video a little bit more carefully. And what's interesting is on a video, some things seem really shallow and not steep and not abrupt, right? And then you get there in person and you're like, oh, this is a little bit more aggressive than I thought. And what was really cool about that experience was that I had someone really qualified going in front of me in the same type of Jeep. And so my thinking wasn't that I'm a really great driver and my minute of YouTube video is going to totally pay off. But my thinking was that, man, I was like, well, the same Jeep is in front of me, and if I just do what they do, it'll be okay. If I just stick with them, it'll be okay. And I'm here, so it was. And I think in that same way is that when we're going through those valleys, like, we don't have to know the end to get there. We don't have to know the timeline to be able to achieve it. We don't have to know all the details of how it's going to work out. We don't even have to be able to see the sunshine because we're with God. He says something unusual next. He says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This is sort of there's a little bit of debate exactly what these mean, but the consensus seems to be the rod is sort of like a club that the shepherd would use to beat off the predators. It's a defensive weapon or an offensive weapon, depending on the shepherd, I guess. But that the rod was there to protect the sheep. And so he's saying, hey, you as the shepherd are there, and in the midst of that, there's no predator that's going to get to my soul because you're keeping them at bay with the rod. But the staff is actually more sheep-oriented. So you get the rod that takes care of the enemies outside, and the staff kind of keeps the sheep in line. That sometimes in the midst of difficulty or heartache or just challenge to obey, we want to kind of do our own thing. And God uses that staff to bring the sheep back, to rescue that sheep, to guide the sheep, to whack the sheep if necessary. And there's these two enemies that the shepherd is able to handle both. He's able to handle the enemies outside, and he's able to handle the enemies inside. And so here David says he's comforted with the rod and the staff. That the force and the power of the shepherd is of comfort to the sheep because the sheep are cared for. In the role of shepherd, you want someone who's capable and powerful, and when the lion comes, they can deck them. Or when the bear comes, he can conquer them. And David says, hey, this shepherd can do both. And he knows when it's time to use the rod, and he knows when it's time to use the staff. Verse 5 here is amazing. He says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. He's kind of shifting analogies here from the shepherd analogy to a full-on party analogy. This is awesome. He says this shepherd prepares a table. Now notice the first word, you. He's changing to like explaining to everyone else what the shepherd is to him. He's like, it starts off, the first couple of verses, he says, hey, I want you to know how good the shepherd is. I want you to understand how good the shepherd is. I want you to trust in the shepherd. And then at some point in time, in verse 5, he just kind of loses track of anyone else there. He's just talking right to the shepherd now. Like he's talking right to God. He says, hey, God, he says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. This is awesome. Here, this is like unusual of any battle. He's acknowledging the enemies are all around. In fact, they're right in front of me. But what you see that's unusual is that instead of actually saying gear up for battle, he says, but in the midst of all these enemies, he says, you're putting on a party. He says that there's a banquet spread. Now, I was never in the military, but from all my reading and study of it, like they don't typically like right before a battle, like have this big feast right with the enemies right in front of them, because usually they're trying to harm you. I'm getting some no's. Like that's a terrible tactic. And yet, what God does here is he says, hey, he's so unthreatened by the enemy that he's putting on a party for us right in front of the enemy. Now notice the enemy's still there. Right? The enemy isn't gone. The enemy is still in opposition to. And yet God says, like David's reflecting, God says, hey, right in front of these enemies, you're celebrating. And I think this is encouragement, hopefully, for our hearts this Thanksgiving, is that maybe you feel like you're right in front of the enemies, and yet God still sets a good table. And I'm not talking about turkey, or I'm definitely not talking about stuffing, probably talking about pie. But in the midst of all this, God sets a good table. You can feast in front of your enemies. Because God's not threatened by your enemies. Now, they're enemies to us, for sure. But they're not enemies. They're not significant enemies to God. And so instead of gearing up for battle, he's putting on a party. He says, you anoint my head with oil and my cup overflows. This is the idea of this awesome host. Now, I've never had this like experience in a party, but like this would have been pretty common back then, that they would anoint their heads with oil as they're coming to like a really elaborate party. And this is part of this like celebration piece. So this isn't just a simple party, but it's going full celebration here. That he's anointing his head with oil, and he says the cup just overflows. There's this non-stop abundance coming from the heart of God, which I think is amazing. Have you ever gone to the restaurant and you have a server and they're just like, tell me when? Now maybe I'm an evil person, probably am, but I'm always curious, like if I didn't tell them when, would they just keep pouring? You know, like would they literally make my cup overflow? I'm going to try it someday. I haven't yet, but I'm going to try it someday. But here at God's table, that this abundance is just non-stop. That like this celebration in presence of the enemies is endless. And that while enemies are there, you can still party. The abundance of God is not cut off because of the presence of some people who are trying to tear you down, or the power of Satan who's trying to take you out. His reflection here is, he says, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me. Now what's goodness? Well, this is the favor of God, the favor of the shepherd. That he says, hey, he says, as you're walking about, as you're going in these green pastures with still waters, he said, as you walk from there into that valley of the shadow of death, the goodness of God is chasing you. It's following, like wherever he went, the goodness of God was there. Isn't this cool that David saw the goodness of God as much in the backside of the desert raising some sheep as he did in the palace of the king? That wherever he went, God's goodness was after him. But there's this other piece here, this word mercy. And English translations really have a hard time with this. Depending on your translation, you might see some different phrasing here. But this is this idea of covenant promise. That God commits himself to his people unilaterally. And so that David says, wherever I'm going, whether that is like in the stillest places and their relaxation in this oasis, or whether I'm in the valley of death, or whether I'm in front of my enemies, the promises of God on my life remain unchanged. And in fact, I can't get away from them. That they're following me. Isn't that amazing? You wake up tomorrow morning and the promises of God are already there. They're kind of looking over you. You're like, ooh, that's freaky. No, that's awesome. And then as you go throughout your day, you're not like leaving the promises in the presence of God, but his promises through Jesus follow you. And then as you lay down at night and go to sleep, or try to find sleep, that the presence of God and his promises follow you. He said, surely they shall follow me. How long? Well, all the days of my life. That there's never going to be a day that the promises of God are not there for you. On the good days, on the bad days, on the days that your heart is full of joy and celebration, on the days it's full of pain, that the goodness of God is there every day of your life. The goodness of God, his commitment to you, is even on the days where you've wandered off into sin. That he is there and he's ready to bring you back. So we celebrate surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And he says, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord. How long? Forever. This is amazing. He's saying, I'm not a guest in God's house. I'm not a visitor in the house of God. He said, I'm family. Because only family gets to stay in the house forever. And even there's some terms with kids. David says, I am in God's house forever. That there's never a day that he's going to get kicked out of that. There's never a day that God's going to tire of him. That he is residing in the house of God. I think this is also part of this piece. This is why I partially lean towards this is written as a king. Is because David knows what it means to live in the house of the king. And he's saying, I'm just a sheep. I make mistakes. I go my own way. And yet, I am always welcome in the house of the Father. I'm going to dwell there forever. What an amazing reflection on the heart of our Savior. Maybe this morning you say, I don't know Jesus. I don't have this relationship. I'm on the outside. I'm looking in, and this seems awesome. I would love to have a Savior who cares for me like this. In fact, that's what Jesus wept over Jerusalem, because they were sheep having no shepherd. And so today he welcomes you into his family. Entrance into that family is through a standard of perfection which none of us achieve, but through his blood and through his perfect life that you can have access to. And so that you too this morning can say, the Lord is my shepherd. Maybe this morning you're in these green pastures, you're in these still waters, and that feels awesome. But remember who brought you there. The shepherd brought you there. And why is that so important? Well, if we think we brought ourselves there and we get knocked out of there, how do we get back to there? If you're in green pastures this morning, you have reason to give thanks because your shepherd brought you there. And in this season, in this phase of life, he's making you to lie down and enjoy and relax and refresh and give thanks. Maybe this morning you say, I'm in the valley of the shadow of death. Or I'm at that table, but all I'm seeing is the enemies. I'm kind of like, can't see the food right now. Your shepherd is also there. And with the psalmist, you can say, I don't fear, because the Lord is my shepherd. And he's not sending me out into this area of wolves. He's going with me. He's beside me. His presence is real and it's there. And there's times maybe even in the valleys that we see and understand the heart of the shepherd better than we do even in the green grass. Because sometimes in the green grass we think, maybe we deserved it. We earned it. We're enjoying it. In the valleys we realize, man, we need a shepherd. And we had one and he was there all along, but God just allows these moments to refocus our thinking. I trust that this year that we can give thanks to our shepherd, regardless of where we are coming from this morning. What I'd like to do is I'd like to read this out loud together. Maybe you read it as a confession, maybe it's as a prayer, maybe it's as a creed to remind ourselves of this. As we read this together. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I'd like just for a minute for us to close our eyes and bow our heads. And maybe this morning it's coming to Jesus as that shepherd for the very first time. That you can say, Jesus, I need that shepherd. You've died for me, and I need that sacrifice. I want to be a part of your flock. I want to be able to call you my shepherd. Maybe it's this morning giving thanks and acknowledging that the green pastures that we enjoy are not our making. They were found deliberately and carefully by our shepherd. Maybe it's this morning is that acknowledgement that although we feel alone and Satan wants to tell us that we are alone, we are forgotten, that nobody knows the difficulties that we're facing. No one knows the pain that we feel. That in the midst of that you are our shepherd. So let's take a moment just in quiet prayer to give thanks to the shepherd, the one who cares for our souls. Ask the worship team to come up as we pray. Lord, this morning we give you thanks. We thank you that through Jesus we can declare you as not just a shepherd or the shepherd, but my shepherd and our shepherd. We thank you that you are gracious to us, that you never leave us, that you are both capable of protecting us from enemies without and correcting us when we wander astray. We thank you that even in the valleys that we can't see out of, that you were there. Thank you for restoring our souls. Thank you that we will dwell in your house forever. In your name we give thanks.